Good afternoon. Okay, I thought I would do one more go at this governance, I like to say, series. So if you're, to explain that, government is one method of governance. Ideally, everyone has a form of governance within themselves. And where that governance is perfect within each person, such that they have a good sense of how to be good to everyone else, having a good sense of how people generally want to be treated and what not to do with them, even if you don't have anything codified. Where you have that, you don't need government. You exist in a perfect anarchy, if you will. However, we are humans, and nobody has that perfect sense. And people get bitter, or they get frustrated, or they get jealous, or angry. Any number of things can happen. Any number of things can tip sideways, and once they start sliding sideways, they gain momentum. So hence why I would never consider myself a true anarchist in the sense of there being no governance. There must be some kind of governance, or there is chaos. An anarchy that has some form of governance might be hard to call an anarchy, right? Because it's not, it has governance, even if it's not a government. So that is my primary argument against anarchy, because I just think it's a foolish formulation. Okay, so my last video, I got into what I think is a solution, and I want to emphasize a, underline that, because there could be many solutions, and we likely need to be trying many solutions at the same time in different pockets and in different areas. One of the things I really despise about the accumulation of power that the federal government in the states has accumulated is that it leaves out more robustness. It requires the dependence on a federal government to make the big choices, right? Which means this huge tract of land called the United States is basically homogeneous. There's a little variation between state to state, county to county, city to city, but it is not truly experimental. And if it was experimental, we could gather data about what experiments work, right? As it is, all our politics are basically rhetorical, not logical. There's no logic to the structuring of science. There is no logic to the structuring of our government. There is only a continuous rhetorical debate with science and fact and logic only used to bolster the rhetoric, not in order to make a pure form argument, or even something more complex than a pure form argument can be achieved. Gosh, Reed, if you're listening, isn't it funny how your terms are already slipping into my dialogue? Anyway, that'll be worth a chuckle, hopefully. So what do we do? So my solution was a contract network, preferably one that is blockchain for security, or some other system like that. I honestly don't know much about blockchain. I just know that the people who like blockchain always tell me how secure it is and tell me why it's secure, and I go, that sounds pretty secure, all right. And I just believe them because I don't have any contrary reason to. But to continue, what'll it look like specifically? Because it's one thing to spout off what I think, contracts, yeah, great. And, well, what do you mean by contracts? So And I gave a brief outline of that last time, speaking of something like a Bill of Rights or a Constitution, followed by something more specific. And I think that's generally right. Some form of general format for how these contracts would work. What would the punishments be? Well, the punishment would be lined out within the contract. Most of the time, I would suspect it's, if you break the contract, if you don't follow the contracts within the specifications of the contract, then there's some kind of fee you have to pay or are charged, or some pay in that you lose. And so then that's it, right? However, I would suspect that there would also be some recording of how well you keep your contracts, right? If you don't keep your contracts very well, you would find it harder and more expensive to get more contracts. But a big problem is there has to be a method of repentance, of reformation, of forgiveness, if you will. Debt loads, especially of credibility, cannot be unpayable, right? If they are, then you end up with rebel alliances, you end up with a criminal class, etc., etc. So those who have poor scores, credit scores, for instance, contract scores, would be those who would be eligible for some kind of help, right? What do you mean help? You're talking about an anarchy, right? Well, okay, yeah. Let's shift. There are libertarian, kind of right-wing anarchies that have been formulated, but there is also left-wing socialist anarchies that have been formulated. So the right wing being more capitalistic, obviously the left wing being more socialistic. And I would suggest that, I'm not going to go into the details, but I would suggest that the primary issue with socialism is that, it doesn't have if it doesn't have some form of capitalism embedded in it, that can be a problem, because capitalism is kind of the base function of personal property ownership. And if you do not have personal property ownership, you don't truly have any kind of personal freedom or rights, because the base assumption is that you own yourself. So beyond that, beyond that kind of formatting, you would have, in addition to this kind of base idea of self-ownership and therefore property ownership, you would need to have community. I would suggest this is also where capitalism goes wrong, that humans are communal beings, and any system that tries to get top-heavy, as the American system has, as most governments have, because there's this rush to the top, rush to control as much power as possible. And with that, you lose community. With large corporations, you lose community because they are not there for the community, right? They are there for profit. So at the core of any contractual network system, I would suggest, must be community, local community, or I suppose you could call it virtual community. But the point would be to have a small group that is then associated with other small groups. So like a core of people who know each other and have learned to trust each other. And then they have overlapping communities, right? So that you could probably develop a very good mathematical model, which is informed by science, social studies, and psychology, of what distribution is necessary to create these like chains, like a chain link fence or a mesh. I guess I'm trying to think of what the chainmail armor. Just these overlapping communities, right, that create a whole. And what makes them unified is not necessarily that they all are connected. They are by distance, but they are connected by the similarity of their contract structure. There can be variation, of course. There can be, almost like a landscape. You could see yourself looking at this chainmail, and as it undulates and stuff. But that idea of a not a contract, but a constitution. That constitution creates the boundaries within which a set of contracts can work, or any of the contracts can work. And to go outside of that is to start moving away from standards of ethics, of sustainability, of decency, of civility, of commonality, and sustainability obviously also being sustainability of the environment. Historically, how is it going to work? The idea is to just start doing it. Figure out the format of the contract. Let it be upgradable, because it's going to have to be. Let it be more easily upgradable than our Constitution and all the bureaucratic changes that have happened. But let it be. I mean, I've made videos about how to do this, how to make a concept system that has a rankier system built into it. So that is the format I would suggest as the way it gets updated. And then you have the contracts, which would update as oh my gosh, I keep forgetting the word. As the central contract, I'll call it, since I can't think of the word constitution. So you would then have people simply filling out these contracts. And the contracts would come into being, would become active when enough people were signed into them to do whatever they say. For instance, it could be a contract for a what do they call them? Let's say 1,000 people work 100,000 people work at a company, and they start circulating one of these contracts, and they're basically agreeing to buy out the company as soon as they are able to, so that they can make it a corporate, a co-op. Co-op is the model that all businesses will have to take, I think. Do we want really high intensity people who are willing to do all kinds of crazy antics and exhaust themselves in order to get to the top of the ladder? Sure, we'll utilize them. But we will not let them become the 1% who owns more than the 99%, right? That's what the power of a co-op is. But it must be guided by this contract system that can be updated by anyone, right? Commonality is something I talk about in a lot of my other videos, and the idea of commonality is that we are constantly triangulating between all of humanity, all. We are not interested in anybody being left out of the system. No matter how egregious they seem to be, we have to figure out how they can exist in our communities, or, I mean, if they simply cannot exist in our communities without hurting other people, then we have to figure out a way to somehow not have them be our enemies. Are we going to pay to lock them up for the rest of their lives? Are we going to take it upon our conscience to end their lives? Are we going to expel them from society such that they will form a rival gang to our society? None of those seem like great options, right? That's because it is fundamentally an immoral situation. It is a situation in which there are people who are putting us into an immoral choice, forcing society at large to make an immoral choice. And those things will have to be figured out. I don't have a solid solution. I think to a certain degree we have to get over our fear of creating servants. I know that sounds ridiculous, but the point would be not to make slaves that are chattel, but to make people do jobs to pay for their own existence and their own improvement, right? So that they have to do a job that will cause them to become a better person. That is the only kind of situation I can think of that will allow fundamentally flawed people, like fundamentally evil people, like murderers and psychopaths, would train them over years to be the kind of person that people are willing to trust their kids with. Maybe never that, but that's the goal, right? That's got to be the ideal. All right. I've really gone far afield, but the point is we don't have to start a revolution that has any kind of violence to it whatsoever. We only have to start figuring out what a contract looks like that can replace what the government does, that is ethical enough and is updatable enough, and is not swayed by rhetoric, but is logical and analogical. And I'll explain what that is in another video, if I haven't already, which I probably have. But it has to have the analogical dimension to it, which is holistic. It's everyone. You can't just take these little analytical pieces and build a tapestry of the whole that is trustworthy, because it will only be from the bias of the unbiased observer, which is an inhuman position, which means you are biased against humanity. Ultimately, I believe that's my claim, and I would love to. I don't believe in debate. I'd rather discuss. I'd rather have a commonality conversation with people to find the common ground we have. But I will defend that position to the best of my abilities. Okay. I didn't really build upon the idea of the contracts as much as I intended to, but there's some interesting content here. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for your time.